Hello everyone. I'm Juha-Pekka Alarauhio. I'm working as a university lecturer in English at the University of Oulu in Finland. So greetings from the frozen loins of Norska. And previously I've worked with things like the classical epic and its adaptations in the 19th century mainly. Nowadays I'm working with media in broader terms. Game media in particular, I've done some little test cases in the past years, developing approaches to games as media products for experience, in particular, having a kind of a technological approach to narratives to boost that up. I also used to work as an illustrator. I can't do that anymore. It doesn't support a family, but there's the link to my portfolio if someone's interested. Okay, so I'll try to get through this as quickly as I can. I will involve some theoretical points here, but I also want to devote time to talk through the nitty-gritty of miniature meaning making for the 41st millennium. So here's my case study. So I'm happy to involve my hobby project into my academic work. And here's a shout out to Mikko. So imaginative play in a coherent fantasy story world appears to be an important ingredient in the pastime. This brings miniaturing for many participants closer to world-building, storytelling, and fan practices such as fan fiction. Indeed, perhaps the separation of playing with toys from the playing of games is not useful since these practices exist on a continuum. And my involvement with the fictional worlds of Warhammer has been ongoing for a long time now. And a lot of it has very little to do with actual gaming. And a lot of it has to do with this kind of urge to produce meanings in that world that are not yet there. So there's plenty of motivation for me to practice this kind of thing. Now, I'll take this statement from Carter to place myself into this kind of field. So games do not exist within a circumscribed, separate, and bounded sphere of activity. So I like to put the miniature in this activity right in the middle of crafting, gaming, collecting, and storytelling. Of course, these then have their own relationships between each other and other kinds of activities. But to me, it's really here in the core of the Warhammer hobby. Now, the aims of my study, which is in early stages here, is to kind of come up with ways to explicate which miniatures, in ways in which miniatures function as a medium for meaning making. So what can they do for us in this pursuit for meaning? Here are some questions I formulated. So what are the elements of user interaction that make the miniature medium agentive so that the user can effect some kinds of changes in the media? And then secondly, what are the elements for user interaction that make the miniature medium meaningful as a story world experience in particular? But of course, in other ways, these meanings can come from anything. So my focus for this kind of study that would be quite difficult to do in larger scale, I have the example case, which would be suitable for an article length analysis. So Sergeant Cronenberg's Merry Pranksters, which is the name of my kill team. And then to give a much more focused framing that takes place through a sampling of an activity cycle for a media analysis. So in my approach, I look at miniature crafting as activity situated within and conditioned by multiple loci of resources and meaning. These could be the actual world or the so-called actual world, all kinds of story worlds, Warhammer and otherwise, and then possible worlds, which I guess I would consider these tentative ideas about different story worlds that don't necessarily have a form yet. Now, what would the media situation be for this kind of activity with 40K in particular? So Bateman has suggested that games entail rules and games entail fiction. And is 40K and its miniatures double situated in this way? I would say most definitely, maybe in more ways than these two, but this seems to be the case definitely. So for me, rules and narratives become these two meaning-making sub-assemblies within 40K. So rules being a solution for resolving changes in game states, and narrative fiction being a solution for accounting for changes in storyboard states. But what about miniatures then? So I approach miniature media interactions as being multimodal and intermedial. And these are very broad categories, and I make sure I show examples of these in practice as well. But in my definition, multimodality refers to humans interacting and communicating information often simultaneously in several modes, such as the verbal and the visual, whereas intermediality refers to the phenomena that occurs between media. Now, these are kind of two different concepts. There's a very significant intermingling between them, and I'll show a practical example of these as well. So intermedial perspective to the intrinsic multimodality of media often focuses on the transformative aspects of the interplay of different semiotic systems. You can transform meanings through all kinds of intermedial linking. So let's move on to the example here. So looking at the miniature media and its components of meaning in one of the members of the team. So here is Sarks the Ogrin. So in the left corner, we can see a list of media modalities that we can see here in action. So we have the visual modality, represented by colors, textures, and shapes, for instance. We have the tactile modality, so you can touch this miniature, you can pick it up, you can potentially harm yourself on the spikes. There's a spatial modality, so it's in 3 dimensions, which makes it possible for you to view it from different perspectives. There's a kind of a temporal modality. The miniature itself is static. It would be great fun if it were animated, but it does have a kind of a temporal modality as well, because you can place this miniature in different places on the board, and therefore it kind of gains different values according to the situations in the game. And finally, we have the semiotic modalities where our perceptions begin to mean things. So there we have all kinds of represented modalities, like we can again have a kind of a represented temporality for this miniature. So there's clearly some kind of ongoing situation here represented by the posture of moving about. Then there's the base with some kind of unfolding situation. It's clearly a kind of historically situated environment in which this miniature is located. Now, when we take these and start kind of interpreting and seeing meanings in them, we arrive at these intermedial transformations there on the right side. So at this stage, these individual features combine, they start connecting with all kinds of narratives we may have in mind. So here we have the chaos star, we recognize that. We have the tentacles and the claw. All of these link up with these kind of general ideas and narratives about chaos. Then we have the fly head, the pustules and the saws. We have the Nurgle's rope and decay that also seem to link to narratives about Nurgle in particular. So here we have this transformation of meaning of these individual media modalities into something that's no longer based on the visual appearance alone, but rather connects to meanings outside the miniature. But there I have this third group, so the trophy head, the saw blade, the trench base, the grime, these then don't necessarily connect to anything ready-made in that story universe, and then we may start wondering whether these are things that are individually linked to Sark's the Ogryn story. So there's that level of storytelling going on as well. And I think here we have now approached the meaning-making node for this figure. So quickly before I move on to showing examples of this kind of crafting for meaning, a couple of concepts that I've used here to try to make this more visible, this progress towards new meaning. So analyzing meaning making in an activity cycle. So I have two main ideas, the drive and the situatedness for this activity. So the drive comes from these things I borrowed from rhetorical theory. So any exigence is an imperfection marked by urgency. It's a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be. We all know what that is. It's gray, it's plastic, and it's shuttered in your closet. Then there's the situatedness. So we perform actions in concrete circumstances, and I call that here situated actions according to Suchman's theory. And the progress in really kind of abstract terms can be formulated through this three-part structure, so postulation, extrapolation, and interpolation. So first you come up with something, some basic idea, there could be X. Now extrapolation then builds on that. So if you have X, there could perhaps also be Z. And interpolation is a point where you see these two nodes of meaning, and then you realize that, okay, X and Z make sense only if there's Y between them, or they are somehow better explained if there's also Y. So let's have a look at an activity cycle driven by this kind of structure. So starting with this postulation. So the first thing to go with is to start thinking about how does this character of this Ogryn fall into Nurgle? How do we communicate this? And the exigence here is some kind of Nurgle reference. So what I need is that. Now, at this moment, I have limited resources. My cousin happened to have a Death Guard box with some extra heads. So I had some options here. And what I ended up going with was the one in the center. So the fly head was appealing because it was really kind of emblematic for Nurgle. Plus, it's quite large, so it's a nice fit for an Ogryn. So the solution for this exigency was to swap the head and give it immediately a more kind of Nurglish quality. The media modality involved here is spatial. So now I have kind of fulfilled that 3D shape, and that serves to give me another exigence. So I can see now that I have the figure there, it's not painted. Now, of course, these exigencies are individual. Someone might be just happy playing with that unpainted miniature, but I never am. So what I start doing is extrapolating. So what kind of color scheme would be fitting for that fly head? Now, for this, my resource was actual word reference. I don't really know what fly heads look like when you're looking at them very closely. So I went for Google, and then I thought there must be some kind of fly who is really into dead corpses. And of course there was. It's appropriately named sarcophaga. So the corpse eater, the flesh fly in vernacular. So I decided I'm going with that paint scheme because it looks kind of cool, and it's also very appropriate for Nurgle. The media modality now is visual, so I'm applying the colors on that miniature. And at this stage, I have the head quite ready, but it does give me another exigence, so narrative grounding. How does this fly head come to be? And the easy answer, of course, for me is just to go to the story world. And there I can find the narrative grounding. It's a Nurgle's blessing. This is kind of a modest way of telling a story. I guess I could elaborate on that, but that seemed one way of doing it at that time. So here the media modality now is semiotic, so I'm kind of indexically referring to that story about Nurgle's blessings through this medium. But there's another way of this happening. So while I was doing this, there was also this contingency-driven activity cycle. So this is what artists, I suppose, sometimes call happy accidents. So I thought, well, I've seen this kind of character somewhere before. And then, of course, I remembered the film The Fly and started Googling that. And the image of this character in the Neumann version of the film really struck home because it has the claw as well, very similar in shape as we have with Sark's. Now, this becomes a kind of a resource that I haven't used, but it does give me a new exigence. So at this point, if I go with this, I could start adapting the narrative from The Fly to Warhammer 40k environment. So in this, the resources are, of course, in fiction. And one of the solutions was to expand the team narrative. I'm including this character, Sergeant Cronenberg, taking the director's name for the 85 film. I guess that just sounded a bit more sinister than Neumann. But it's kind of the character is now separated into two. This gives rise to multiple exigencies. So I thought this is a good example of how the story begins to kind of grow exponentially very quickly. So who is this Sergeant Cronenberg? How did Sarks end up in this state? And how and why did the team fall to chaos in the first place? So maybe this adaptation from The Fly could give me some ideas on how to handle this. Maybe it wasn't kind of consensual with this Ogryn to become this kind of mutated monstrosity. So having done a little bit of this kind of analysis, there are some early stage ideas that I have about miniature meaning making. And at this point, it seems like it's multiple things. It's autotelic, so meaning making takes place through user postulations. But at the same time, it's kind of dialogic. So exigencies arise from these postulations and generate cycles of demands and responses. So you feel like there's someone kind of doing it with you. And of course it is because there's the community and all kinds of narratives by other people. It's also hermeneutic, as the user interpretively accounts for the relationships between parts and the whole in the effort of interpolating between emerging meaning gaps. And then it's situated as any crafting solution is conditioned by the contingencies of the meaning-making context. There's the availability and recognition of resources for solutions. So, for instance, the blade in the weapon, the buzzsaw, was in fact some kind of piece from a timepiece or a watch I got from a friend. So that added brutality just came to be because I happened to have this component at hand. Now, following Petri Lankoski's idea that the player character forms the contact point between the player and game in digital games, I thought that this might be also kind of reworked through the miniature medium. So through the activity of crafting, the miniature forms multiple intermediate contact points that involve agency. In particular, so between the user and the story world of 40k, between the user and resources, be they crafting materials or narratives, and finally between the user and game systems of 40k, which I didn't really comment on this in this talk. So if we take something, some kind of game system that really invests a lot on what you see is what you get, of course, then there's a lot of agency that is potentially there for miniature crafters. but of course not all game systems will take note of this. So how do I plan to move forward? Of course, I would like to conclude this analysis, but then I would really want to expand this study. So what would be the tabletop gaming situation be? So 40K meaning making on the tabletop, miniatures and narratives as resources for making storyboard sense of changes in game state. So I would really like to observe gamers playing and how do these different narratives then become instrumental in that experience. So is it transmedial? Is there some kind of co-creation of narratives? Does it become agonistic, which would be really fun to see if these narratives become these kind of battlegrounds as well. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I'm afraid I didn't get very far with explaining how the narrative evolves for the merry pranksters. I can reveal something after questions if we have time.